Title: The Silent House. Chapter 1: The Invitation. Rachel hadn't thought much about the letter when it first arrived. It was, after all, an ordinary envelope, yellowed with age, stamped with an old postmark from a distant time. The paper inside, though, had a peculiar weight to it, as if it had been folded and unfolded 100 times before it reached her hands. She didn't even recognize the return address. Just a small cottage-like address marked with Aunt Eleanor's name, a relative she had only the vaguest recollection of. Another one of those strange old relatives, Rachel muttered to herself, tossing the letter onto the kitchen counter as she prepared breakfast for Emma. Her daughter, only 10 years old, had been fidgeting at the table for what felt like an eternity. Her dark eyes curious and bright, filled with questions she didn't always understand. "Daddy told me about Aunt Eleanor," Emma piped up, her voice barely a whisper, as if she knew that speaking any louder might break the fragile silence in their small kitchen. "Wasn't she weird?" Rachel paused, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "That's enough, Emma. Don't speak ill of people you don't know." But Emma had never known Aunt Eleanor. She had never met her at family gatherings. No one had, really. Rachel's memories of her aunt were clouded by fog, half-formed thoughts of a woman whose presence seemed to come and go like a shadow in the corner of her childhood. There had been stories, whispers, about Eleanor, strange things that made their family uneasy. And yet, when Rachel looked at the letter again, something made her linger over it. Perhaps it was the timing. The envelope had arrived just after Rachel and her husband Ethan had talked about escaping the noise of their busy city life. They needed a retreat, something to bring their family back together. A cabin, some quiet time. That's exactly what the letter seemed to offer. The invitation was cryptic but enticing. "Come to the house I have left you. A gift. A place to rest your weary mind. Do not delay." No return address. Just the words, Briarwood, beneath her aunt's name. After a moment's hesitation, Rachel placed the letter on the dining table and moved toward the window, looking out at the grey sky. The world outside was muted and still. There were no birds, no movement, not even the sound of cars. She felt the heavy, suffocating quiet that had been plaguing her for the past few weeks. It was as if the world outside was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for them. Ethan had come home early the next morning, unannounced, and when he found the letter, he was immediately intrigued. "Briarwood," he had said, reading aloud with a slight smile. "Sounds like something out of a ghost story." Rachel smiled weakly, trying to shake the unease she felt at the thought of visiting some remote corner of the world where no one could find them. But Emma, ever the curious one, looked up at her father and asked, "Is it safe?" Ethan chuckled, tousling Emma's hair. "Of course, sweetheart. What could be safer than a weekend away from everything? The world can't hurt us there." Despite Ethan's light-hearted response, Rachel couldn't shake the growing sense that something about this trip was wrong. Briarwood wasn't a name she was familiar with, yet it rang in her mind like a half-remembered dream, a place she thought she had heard of but couldn't place. And so, the decision was made. Despite her lingering doubts, the pull of the quiet cabin, the promise of peace, seemed irresistible. They packed their things, leaving the noise of the city behind, embarking on a journey to a place neither of them truly understood. The drive to Briarwood was long, too long. The trees seemed to stretch on forever, their gnarled limbs twisting like hands reaching for the sky. The road grew narrower and the air heavier the further they ventured. Rachel felt a strange tension rising in her chest as the landscape around them darkened, the setting sun swallowed by the dense forest that surrounded them on all sides. "Just a few more miles," Ethan had said, glancing at the GPS, though it wasn't really helping. The signal kept flickering, and the roads seemed to get smaller, winding through the forest like a maze. Rachel tried to ignore the knot forming in her stomach, focusing instead on the calming sound of Emma's voice in the back seat, asking about the animals they might see in the woods. It was supposed to be an adventure after all, a family getaway. "Mom, look," Emma said, pointing excitedly to the right. "A deer!" Rachel turned to look, her eyes momentarily distracted by the movement in the trees. But when she turned back to the road, the woods ahead seemed darker than before. A veil of fog had begun to creep across the path, spreading like a slow tide, enveloping the entire road ahead. She shivered, pulling the seatbelt tighter across her body as a sense of unease washed over her. "I don't like this," she whispered, almost to herself. "What was that?" Ethan asked, glancing at her with raised eyebrows. Rachel shook her head. I feel like we're being watched." But before Ethan could respond, the car's headlights flickered, casting shadows against the thick fog that had appeared almost out of nowhere. The road became narrow, too narrow. The trees were closing in, the air pressing against the windows like something alive. "Look!" Emma shouted, her voice high-pitched with excitement. "Is that our cabin?" Rachel blinked, looking ahead. At first she couldn't see anything through the fog, but then, like a ghost emerging from the mist, the shape of a house appeared. A cabin indeed. It stood isolated and forlorn at the edge of the woods, a faint light flickering from its windows. The structure was old, weathered wood and peeling paint. The roof sagged slightly, the chimneys covered in soot, but there was something about it that felt wrong. The trees surrounding it were unnaturally still, their branches bent like hands frozen mid-motion. The land sloped downwards, the house seemingly sitting at the bottom of a hollow. Rachel felt a pang of dread shoot through her chest. "Are you sure this is it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Ethan, his usual confident self, smiled and nodded. "It's perfect. It's just like the picture in the letter. I told you Aunt Eleanor knew how to pick a spot." The car crunched slowly over the gravel driveway, and the house loomed closer. Emma was already unbuckling her seatbelt. "I want to see inside!" she exclaimed, bouncing with excitement. Rachel hesitated before exiting the car, her eyes tracing the perimeter of the property. The fog had thickened, and the house, though beautiful in its own eerie way, seemed like it had been waiting for them. The silence was almost oppressive now, like an invisible pressure pressing down on her every move. As they unloaded the bags from the car, Rachel felt a strange sensation crawling over her skin, an unsettling, intangible feeling, as if the house had already begun to consume them. The wind was still, the trees unmoving, not a single sound except for the creak of the old wooden gate as it swung open. The door to the cabin stood ajar. A note was pinned to it, written in Aunt Eleanor's unmistakable script. "Welcome home. The game has already begun." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Before she could even process the meaning of the note, Emma dashed into the cabin, eager to explore. Ethan followed, chuckling. But Rachel stayed behind for a moment, staring at the darkened windows, the door that swung too easily, and the oppressive silence that smothered everything around her. "The game has already begun." The words echoed in her mind as she followed her family inside. Chapter 1. The Invitation, Part 2. As Rachel stepped inside, a cold draft swept through the air, sending a shiver down her spine. The door creaked shut behind her with a finality that seemed to echo through the house, and for a moment she stood in the dim hallway, taking in the oppressive stillness that filled the air. The walls of the cabin, weathered by time, were lined with dark wooden paneling that gave off the faint smell of mildew and the faintest hint of something older, something ancient. There were no pictures on the walls, no signs of life, just a thick, almost suffocating silence that pressed against her like a wall. "Mom! Look!" Emma's voice rang out from further inside, her excitement echoing down the hall. "I found a big, old book in the living room." Rachel turned toward her daughter's voice, still hesitant to go deeper into the house. Her pulse quickened, a creeping sense of unease gathering at the back of her mind. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong, but she tried to push it away. Ethan, hearing Emma's excited call, laughed, his footsteps already heading toward the living room. Rachel took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was supposed to be a fresh start, an escape from the chaos of the city. It was just an old house in the woods, her aunt's house. Nothing to be afraid of, she told herself. Still, the stillness in the air unsettled her. It wasn't just the quiet. It was the way it wrapped itself around everything, suffocating, leaving no room for sound to escape. It was unnatural, like the house itself was holding its breath. Waiting, she moved cautiously into the living room, her feet sinking into the thick old carpet. The room was grand, though aged. Long wooden beams crisscrossed the ceiling, and an imposing stone fireplace stretched across one wall. It should have felt warm, inviting, but instead it felt like a forgotten place, abandoned by time itself. The only light in the room came from a single lamp in the corner, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. Emma was sitting on the worn leather armchair, her small hands leafing through an old yellowed book. The pages were brittle, the words faded, but the pictures, crude, almost childlike drawings, seemed to shimmer strangely in the low light. "Look at this," Emma said, her voice breathless with excitement. "It's like a storybook, but some of the pictures, they look real, like they're moving." Rachel frowned, walking over to her daughter. As she peered over Emma's shoulder, she saw the drawings, sketches of twisted trees, dark figures lurking in shadows, and strange symbols that seemed to pulse with an energy of their own. There were no words at all in the book, just these bizarre, unsettling images that seemed to shift and warp the longer she stared at them. She reached for the book, but before she could touch it, Emma pulled it away. "No, I want to keep looking at it," she said, her tone uncharacteristically defiant. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. There was something about the way Emma spoke, a kind of strange urgency in her voice, that made her feel uneasy. She took a step back, her gaze lingering on the book before reluctantly moving away. The last thing she wanted was to escalate things. "All right, Emma, just be careful." Ethan was in the corner, fiddling with the fireplace. "This place could use a little warmth," he said, his voice casual, but Rachel noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he worked the logs into the hearth. He managed to get a fire started, the flames crackling and hissing, but they didn't bring the comfort she expected. Instead, the fire cast an almost unnatural glow across the room, creating deep, shifting shadows that seemed to reach out and move of their own accord. The air grew colder, though the fire blazed brightly in the hearth. Rachel rubbed her arms, trying to chase away the chill. She turned toward the windows, half expecting to see something watching them from the forest outside. But all she could see was the thick wall of mist that had begun to creep over the yard. It was still too early in the evening for fog to form so quickly, but there it was, pressing against the glass, creeping its way toward them like fingers stretching out to claim them. "Ethan," Rachel said, her voice trembling slightly, "do you feel that the air in here, it's cold?" Ethan turned from the fire, the flickering light catching his face. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's just the place, Rach. Old houses get like this. Don't start overthinking things." Rachel forced a smile, but her unease deepened. The house felt too still, too quiet, as if it were listening, waiting for them to make the wrong move. She glanced back at Emma, who was now muttering under her breath, her fingers tracing the pages of the strange book. Her voice was low, like a chant, something foreign, something that sent a shiver crawling down Rachel's spine. "Emma," Rachel said sharply, her voice laced with concern. "What are you saying?" Emma looked up, her eyes wide and unblinking. "The pictures are talking to me," she whispered, her lips curling into a strange smile. "They say I need to play. They say I have to play the game." Rachel's heart stopped. She froze, staring at her daughter, who had never behaved like this before. Emma's expression wasn't one of playfulness. There was something deeper, something darker in her gaze, something that chilled Rachel to the bone. Before Rachel could respond, Ethan interrupted, his voice strained. "Okay, that's enough, Emma. You're starting to freak your mum out. Put the book down." Emma's eyes flickered with an odd kind of joy. "No," she whispered, almost to herself, as if she were in a trance. "The game has already started. The silence is part of it. We have to be quiet." The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and Rachel felt a cold weight pressing against her chest. She could hear the faintest echo of whispers, just on the edge of her hearing, as if the house itself was breathing. Slow, heavy breaths, filled with a dark intent. "Ethan, we need to leave," Rachel said, her voice cracking with desperation. This isn't right. This place, it's wrong. But Ethan shook his head, his face hardening. Stop it, Rachel. You're scaring Emma. This is a family vacation. We're here to relax. There's nothing wrong. Rachel's mind raced, but she couldn't find the words to explain what she was feeling. The house had already taken root in their minds, twisting the air around them. She felt it now. The silent pressure, the weight of something unseen and dark watching them from the corners of the room. Emma's voice broke through the silence again, but this time it was softer, almost hypnotic. The game is waiting. The room was so quiet now that Rachel could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears. It was as though time itself had slowed down, the space around them growing heavier with every passing second. She looked toward the door, but the hallway beyond seemed impossibly long, stretching out into nothingness. Her feet felt rooted to the floor, as if the house itself was pulling her in, holding her captive. And then, just as the silence threatened to swallow her whole, the floor creaked. Rachel whipped around, her breath catching in her throat. Something was moving. Chapter 2. The First Night. The night came swiftly, as it always does in the deep woods, swallowing up the last remnants of daylight in one greedy gulp. Rachel had tried to shake off the feeling of dread gnawing at her from the inside out, but the silence in the house was almost unbearable. No hum of appliances, no sounds of distant traffic or wildlife. The world outside seemed to have closed off entirely, as if the cabin had somehow become a tomb. It was almost as if the house itself had exhaled a sigh of relief when the sun finally dipped below the horizon. The temperature dropped sharply, and Rachel could feel the chill settle deep in her bones. They had eaten dinner in silence, the words few and strained between them. Even Emma, who normally never stopped talking, had fallen eerily quiet. She sat at the table, picking at her food, her gaze unfocused, staring at something far beyond the walls of the cabin. Rachel had tried to get her to speak, tried to shake her out of the trance she seemed to be under, but Emma only responded in whispers. "The game is watching," Emma had muttered, her voice low and deliberate, as if someone, something, had instructed her on what to say. Rachel had shushed her, the panic rising in her throat. Ethan, though, had laughed it off, dismissing it as a figment of Emma's imagination. "It's just the house, Rach," he'd said, his voice forced cheerfulness. "I told you, it's just old. Nothing here is going to hurt us." But Rachel had noticed the way his hand trembled slightly when he poured his drink, the tightness in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. She knew her husband well enough to sense that he was trying to convince himself, just as much as he was trying to convince her. After dinner, they settled into the living room by the fire. Ethan and Rachel sat together on the worn leather couch, but neither of them spoke. They simply stared into the flickering flames, the silence pressing in on them like an unseen weight. Outside, the fog had thickened, wrapping the house in a suffocating embrace. The world beyond the cabin was reduced to a shadowy blur. Rachel couldn't help but feel the unsettling sense that something was moving out there, just out of sight, waiting. The trees, their branches twisted and reaching, seemed to bend toward the cabin, their limbs scratching against the windows like fingers begging to be let inside. "I'm going to bed," Emma said suddenly, standing up and leaving the room without another word. Rachel looked after her, the unease growing in her chest. There was something deeply wrong with Emma tonight. Something in her manner, in her strange mutterings and odd expressions. She had never acted like this before, and it terrified Rachel more than she could put into words. Ethan, noticing her concern, placed a hand on her arm. "She's just tired. Let's not make a big deal out of it." Rachel forced a smile, but her thoughts were elsewhere. "I guess you're right. It's been a long day." But even as she said the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, that the house was watching her. It was like the walls had eyes, and the floorboards beneath her feet were waiting for her to make a misstep. Ethan, oblivious to her growing fear, leaned back in the couch and closed his eyes. "I'm going to take a quick nap," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Rachel nodded absent-mindedly, but her mind was elsewhere. The room seemed to be closing in on her, and the flickering light from the fire cast grotesque shadows across the walls. Shadows that twisted and shifted, taking on strange shapes that made her heart race in her chest. She couldn't focus on anything. It felt like the house was alive, like it was breathing, pulsing with a life of its own. Suddenly, the silence in the cabin was shattered by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor from upstairs. Emma's room. Rachel jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. She shot a quick glance at Ethan, but he didn't seem to have heard it. He was still leaning back, eyes closed, his breathing slow and steady. "Did you hear that?" Rachel asked, her voice strained. Ethan frowned, opening his eyes. "What? You're just hearing things." "No, Ethan," Rachel said urgently. "Something fell. Upstairs." Ethan sighed, standing up from the couch. "It's probably just Emma playing around. She's been acting strange all evening." Rachel didn't respond. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had caused the noise was far worse than Emma simply being careless. The sound had been too loud, too unnatural. It had the echo of something else. She stood up and started to move toward the stairs, but just as she reached the base, she froze. A strange sensation washed over her, like fingers creeping up her spine. It wasn't the sound of the house settling. No, it felt like someone was behind her, watching her, breathing down her neck. She whipped around, her breath shallow, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the shifting shadows. "Rachel?" Ethan's voice called from behind her. "What are you doing?" She didn't answer him. Her eyes were fixed on the top of the stairs, where a faint glow now flickered from under the door to Emma's room. The door was ajar. Rachel's pulse quickened. She felt as though she were being drawn to it, the room pulling her like a magnet. She took a step forward, her hand trembling as it gripped the rail. Another sound. This time, a soft scratching came from above, followed by a whisper. The voice was low, muffled, like someone was calling her name from just beyond the door. "Mum, come inside." Rachel's heart leapt into her throat. She opened the door, her breath tight in her chest, but the room was empty. Emma's bed was made, the blankets smooth as though no one had slept there. The faint glow that had come from under the door was gone, leaving only the dull, oppressive darkness of the room. But something was different. The air was thick, dense with an unnatural stillness. Rachel stepped into the room cautiously, her feet barely making a sound on the creaky wooden floor. That's when she saw it. At the far corner of the room, just beyond the wardrobe, there was a small circular object lying on the floor. It was a child's toy, a wooden top, its edges smooth and worn from years of use. Rachel bent down to pick it up, but her fingers stopped just short of touching it. The top was spinning, slowly, on its own. Rachel stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her heart pounded in her chest as the top continued to spin, faster now, as though it had a life of its own. Before she could pull her hand away, the room seemed to shift. The walls stretched outward, the shadows growing longer and more oppressive. The floor beneath her feet began to hum, a low vibrating sound that she felt deep in her chest. The top spun faster, its wooden surface beginning to glow with an eerie light. And then the whispers began. They started out faint, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves in a distant wind. But as the top spun faster, the whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single familiar voice. "It's time to play," the voice whispered, a cold, chilling breath against her ear. Rachel's blood ran cold. She turned quickly, her eyes scanning the room. But there was no one there. The whispers continued, growing louder, as the shadows around her twisted and shifted, taking shape. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw something that made her heart stop. Emma was standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide and vacant. She wasn't speaking anymore. She was just watching Rachel with a strange, detached expression on her face, her mouth slightly open, as if she were about to say something. But the words never came. The room seemed to close in on Rachel. The walls pressed in tighter, the shadows growing deeper. The floor beneath her feet began to groan, as if the house itself were alive and aware. The top spun faster, faster, until it seemed to blur with speed, and then everything went still. Emma's eyes flashed, and she whispered, "The game has already begun." And suddenly, the door slammed shut. Chapter 3. The Stains of the Past. The morning light did not bring the relief Rachel had hoped for. It was a grey, oppressive dawn, with clouds hanging low in the sky, as though the world itself had become submerged under a heavy, waterlogged blanket. The mist from the previous night lingered in the trees, thick and stubborn, refusing to lift. It seemed as though the forest had swallowed the sun, casting a long, lingering twilight over the cabin, even though the clock read late morning. Rachel was sitting at the kitchen table, staring into her coffee cup. The steam rising from it curled in on itself like something alive. She hadn't slept much, barely more than a few restless hours, her mind full of shadows and whispers. She felt like she was still trapped inside the dream she had that night, the one where Emma's voice echoed from the shadows, soft and insistent. "The game has already begun." The words echoed in her mind, a constant refrain that clung to her thoughts like cobwebs. Rachel tried to push them away, but they were relentless. Every creak of the house, every flicker of light, made her jump. Her nerves were frayed, and she felt the ever-present weight of dread pressing against her chest. Ethan was still asleep upstairs. He'd barely stirred when Rachel had gotten up. That was odd in itself. Usually he was an early riser, but this morning he was dead to the world. She didn't know if that was a blessing or another sign that something was deeply wrong with him too. And then there was Emma. Rachel hadn't heard her since she had come to the door last night, her hollow eyes staring into Rachel's soul. The child had disappeared into the shadows of the house after that, and Rachel hadn't been able to find her since. "Emma?" Rachel called tentatively from the kitchen doorway, hoping that the sound of her own voice might reassure her. But there was no answer, no footsteps, nothing. She hesitated. The atmosphere in the house was too heavy, like the air had thickened with something unseen, something waiting. As Rachel moved toward the stairs, the floor creaked beneath her, the sound reverberating up through the old wood like a low, groaning sigh. Moments like this felt like something was pulling her toward the past, toward something that had happened here long before she arrived. The hall was dim, lit only by a single weak beam of sunlight filtering through a window at the end of the corridor. She paused outside Emma's door, a shiver running through her as she reached for the knob. It turned with a soft click. Inside, the room was unchanged since the night before. The bed was still perfectly made, as though Emma had never slept in it. The top was gone, the strange wooden toy Rachel had seen spinning so frantically in the darkness of the previous night. Everything appeared in order. But then Rachel saw it. The wall at the far side of the room, where the wallpaper had peeled away, revealed dark stains in the wood. They were irregular, jagged marks, like something had scraped against the surface beneath. A deep, blood-like colour stained the edges, as though someone, or something, had tried to claw their way out from behind the wall. Rachel recoiled, her stomach turning. The smell in the room was faint, but it was enough to make her head spin. Something rancid, decayed. A scent like old wood left out in the rain for too long. "It's nothing," Rachel told herself. But the gnawing feeling in her gut told her otherwise. She had been in this room before, but now it felt wrong. She could no longer shake the feeling that the house was watching her every move, waiting for her to uncover something it wasn't ready to reveal. And then she heard it. A low guttural sound that rose from behind the wall. It was a scraping, like fingernails dragging across wood, but it wasn't something physical. It was as if something was inside trying to claw its way out. Rachel backed away from the wall, her breath shallow. Her hands trembled as she reached for the doorknob. But before she could turn it, the sound stopped. In the eerie silence that followed, Rachel heard something else. A faint laughter, muffled and distorted, as if it were coming from far away or from underneath the floorboards themselves. She swung the door open, nearly stumbling out of the room as a wave of nausea hit her. The air outside felt cool against her flushed skin, and she breathed in deeply, trying to steady her racing heart. "Rachel, what's wrong?" Ethan's voice startled her, and she turned quickly. He was standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at her with a furrowed brow. His expression was unreadable, but there was a strange, almost lost look in his eyes. Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She could barely find the words, the sheer weight of what she had just experienced pressing down on her chest. She motioned weakly toward Emma's room. Something's wrong, Rachel whispered. Her voice cracked with fear, and she wasn't sure whether she was talking to him or to herself. I think something's in this house. Ethan hesitated before descending the stairs slowly, his eyes dark and unreadable. Rachel, you need to calm down. We've been through this already. You're letting your imagination get the better of you. It's an old house. It's probably nothing. No, Ethan. Her voice was stronger now, rising with desperation. This isn't just an old house. There's something here. There's something wrong with this place. I can feel it. And Emma. Rachel's words trailed off, her mind racing. She thought of her daughter, of Emma's cold, unblinking eyes from the night before. The strange way Emma had spoken about the game that seemed to have already begun. Ethan stopped, his face hardening. You're scaring me, Rachel. I don't know what's going on with you, but I think you need to get a hold of yourself. Rachel recoiled, the sting of his words cutting deep. She had hoped Ethan would listen to her, that he would understand, but he didn't. He couldn't. Ethan turned away, heading toward the kitchen, and Rachel stood there in the dark hallway, the silence closing in around her once again. The game had already begun. Later that day. A broken clock hours passed. The sun had fully risen, and the house seemed to breathe with an eerie calm. Rachel had found herself unable to stay in one room for long. The quiet was too thick, too heavy, like it was trying to smother her. Every now and then, she would hear a soft creaking from above, as if someone was walking around upstairs. But when she went up to check, the rooms were empty. She found herself standing in front of the clock in the hallway. It had stopped, its hands frozen at 2:03 a.m., the very hour when the first noise had startled her from sleep. Rachel stared at it for a long time, her gaze fixed on the motionless hands. The air grew colder the longer she stared, and her breath began to mist in the frozen air. The shadows deepened, stretching across the walls, wrapping around her like cold fingers. She felt trapped, as though the house itself had become a labyrinth, pulling her deeper into its heart with each passing second. She didn't know how much time had passed when she heard the soft patter of footsteps behind her. She spun around, expecting to see Emma, but it was Ethan. His face was pale, and his eyes wide with fear. He was holding something in his hands, something small, wrapped in cloth. Ethan, what's going on? Rachel asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His eyes flickered to the clock, and then he held out the small object, revealing a toy, a wooden top, its surface cracked and worn, but unmistakably the same one that had spun so unnaturally the night before. I found this under the floorboards, Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. It was there, hidden away, waiting. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she reached for the toy. It was cold to the touch, its surface slick with a faint, sticky residue. And then, the whispers began again. Chapter 4. The Hollow Whisper. The sun, barely a memory, was swallowed by the unrelenting mist that had returned, thicker than ever. The house, now even more oppressive, breathed in time with the wind, creaking and groaning as though it was slowly coming alive. Each step Rachel took through the dim hallways seemed to echo, swallowed by the silence that hung heavy like an ancient curse. It was as though the house was watching her every move. The floorboards beneath her feet groaned as though they were too old to bear her weight, and the walls, with their peeling wallpaper and jagged wood, seemed to shift just out of the corner of her eye. The corners of her mind, once sharp and clear, had blurred into something darker, an endless loop of whispers, flickering shadows, and glimpses of something just beyond sight. The clock had stopped at 2:03 a.m., the very moment the first chilling sound had shattered her fitful sleep. Rachel had stared at its frozen hands for what seemed like hours, wondering why she couldn't move on. Why couldn't she just turn away from it, from the unease, from the terror clawing at her insides? She hadn't dared to touch it. What if the moment her fingers brushed against its cold surface, time would crack open and release whatever nightmare had been festering in this house for so long? Ethan, still distant and pale, had gone into the woods earlier. His face had been drawn, his eyes clouded with an emotion Rachel couldn't place. She hadn't seen him since, but the air around her had felt heavy with his absence. Perhaps it was a blessing. Perhaps this house had already begun to take him, just as it had taken Emma, just as it had taken everything she had ever known, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Rachel was trapped in this house, bound by invisible threads, held in place by some unseen force that mocked her every attempt to escape. She turned away from the clock, taking a deep breath, forcing herself to move. Her eyes drifted to the hallway, to the door that led to Emma's room. The door stood ajar, the faintest light spilling from within, as if calling her. Her pulse quickened. Something about the room had changed again. She moved slowly, each step careful, deliberate, as though she were walking in a dream she could not wake from. Her fingers brushed against the doorframe, cool and smooth. She stepped inside, the room still, the air thick with the same oppressive silence. But as her eyes swept across the space, she froze. The bed, still made, untouched, empty. The top, the same one Ethan had discovered under the floorboards, was now resting in the middle of the room. It spun silently, its movements impossibly smooth, as though guided by an unseen hand. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes flickered to the walls, her gaze darting back and forth in panic. She didn't want to look, but she knew she had to. She had to know what had changed, what had shifted in this house of forgotten memories. And then, there it was. On the far wall behind the wardrobe, where the stains had once marred the wood, something was different. The marks had deepened, darker, more jagged, like they had spread, pulling the very wood apart. The air was thick with the smell again. Decay, something old and foul. It tasted bitter on her tongue, thick in the back of her throat. Rachel moved closer, her hand trembling as she reached for the wardrobe. Her fingers brushed against the wood, and the coldness shot through her, like touching ice water that had been dipped in the darkest of nights. She pulled the door open with a violent jerk, the creak of the hinges sounding like a scream in the stillness. There was nothing inside, at least, that's what Rachel wanted to believe. But then, just as she began to pull away, she saw it, on the floor, just beyond the wooden paneling. Another toy. This one was different, a doll. Its porcelain face was cracked, the expression frozen in a permanent smile that chilled Rachel's soul. She reached down, her fingers brushing the doll's glassy skin, and felt a wave of sickness flood through her. The whisper started again. It was low, so faint she almost didn't hear it, but it was unmistakable. Play. Play the game. Rachel's body tensed, every nerve alight, her heartbeat a drum pounding in her chest. She jerked her hand back, stumbling as the room seemed to spin, the walls closing in on her. The shadows, once stationary, now writhed with unnatural movement. Shapes, forms, seemed to ripple along the edges of her vision. Faces, twisted, contorted, eyes wide and unblinking, watching, waiting. She backed away from the wardrobe, her mind a blur of panic, but it was too late. The shadows were already there. Her feet were rooted to the floor. She couldn't move. It was as though the house had wrapped its unseen fingers around her, holding her still, leaving her powerless. Play! You must play! The words were clear now, vibrating in her chest, crawling under her skin. They came from everywhere. The walls, the floorboards, the shadows, and then something else, something far worse, a soft laugh, a hollow, guttural sound that didn't come from anyone she knew. It echoed in the room, ricocheting off the walls, reverberating deep inside her skull. It was the sound of something old, something ancient. Her heart pounded as she tried to make sense of it. Who was laughing? Was it Emma? Was it Ethan? Or was it something else? Something that had never left this house. The laughter grew louder, more frantic, as the air grew thick with the stench of decay. The house seemed to be pulsing with some terrible rhythm, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. And then, the walls began to bleed. Rachel screamed. The walls, once dark and weathered, now bled, deep, dark red. like thick ink that oozed from cracks in the wood, spreading across the floor in rivers of crimson. The blood-like substance moved in strange patterns, twisting into symbols she didn't recognize, swirling like a sickening dance. And then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was Emma, or at least, it looked like her. Her eyes were hollow, empty, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile that stretched too wide, too unnatural. Her limbs were long and crooked, as if they were no longer human, no longer part of her. "Mum, come play with us." The words were rasped, distorted, and Rachel felt her blood run cold. She stepped back, but her feet refused to move. Her vision blurred, her mind foggy, as the world around her seemed to fold inward. She could hear it now, the whispers, louder, clearer, the voice of the house, the voice of the game. "Play, play. The game has already begun." Rachel's mind fractured. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The room stretched around her, warped, the shadows no longer just shadows but eyes, thousands of eyes, staring, watching. She couldn't escape. The house wouldn't let her. And then, from the corner of the room, the top spun faster. It had become a blur, faster than the human eye could comprehend. Its wooden surface gleamed with a sickly light, glowing, pulsing with malevolent energy. She had no choice now. The game had already begun. Later that night, the room beneath Ethan had returned, or so it seemed. He entered the room silently, his footsteps barely audible on the thick carpet. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But there was something different about him. Rachel didn't look up as he approached, but she could feel him. The air around him felt cold, like it had been sucked of warmth. "Rachel!" His voice, thin and strained, was barely more than a whisper. "Rachel, I need you to see something." She turned slowly, her eyes haunted, her face pale with fear. He was holding something in his hands. A top, the same one. This time, it was stained with something dark, something wet. It glistened in the dim light, its edges sharp, as though it had been carved into a new shape. "Where did you find that?" Rachel's voice trembled. Ethan didn't answer. He simply stared at her, his eyes wide and vacant. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he set the top down on the floor, and it began to spin. The whispers started again, louder, closer. And Rachel realized she was already too late. The game had begun. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. The house had not let them go. That much was clear. The morning light had failed to bring the clarity Rachel had so desperately sought. Every room she entered seemed more foreign than the last, more suffocating. The air was thick with an ancient weight that pressed against her chest, and no matter how many times she tried to push it aside, the feeling of being watched never ceased. It was as if the house itself were aware of her every movement, of her every thought, and it was waiting for something, or perhaps for someone. Ethan had tried to act normal that morning, though the strain was visible in the way his shoulders hunched when he passed her in the kitchen, or how his voice trembled when he spoke. He couldn't deny what was happening, but he couldn't bring himself to admit it either. His silence spoke louder than any words could have. Rachel moved through the house in a daze, her mind buzzing with thoughts of the night before, the wooden top, the whispers, and the sight of Emma standing in that empty doorway. What was happening to her daughter, and why wasn't Ethan listening? "Mum!" Emma's voice broke through the fog of Rachel's thoughts, a soft, almost hesitant whisper. Rachel spun, her heart leaping into her throat. Emma stood at the edge of the hallway, her small hands clutching the worn edges of her sweater. Her eyes, though wide, seemed distant, as if they saw something far beyond the walls of the house. She didn't speak at first, only stared at Rachel with an expression that was both unfamiliar and unsettling. "What is it, sweetheart?" Rachel's voice trembled. She took a cautious step forward, but Emma remained rooted in place. "They told me," Emma said, her voice too calm, too flat. "The house. It says I have to play." Rachel's breath hitched in her throat. "What do you mean, Emma? Who told you? What game?" Emma's lips curled into a small, eerie smile. The game. It's all around us, Mom. Can't you see it? We're already playing. Rachel's stomach churned. The game. The whispers. The top. The house had been playing them all along. Emma, we need to get out of here. We need to leave now. Rachel's voice broke, the terror she had been suppressing finally slipping free. Please, Emma, listen to me. But Emma only shook her head, her vacant eyes unblinking. We can't leave. The game doesn't let us leave. It's already started. Rachel's heart sank. She felt herself drifting into an abyss of helplessness. Emma, we're going to be okay. I won't let anything happen to you. I promise. The faintest flicker of recognition crossed Emma's face. But before Rachel could say anything more, Emma turned away, walking slowly toward the stairs, her steps echoing down the empty hall. Rachel's hands trembled as she grasped the banister. This was no longer just a feeling. This was no longer just paranoia. The house was alive in ways she hadn't even begun to understand. And Emma, her daughter, was slipping away from her, swallowed by whatever darkness lurked in the walls. It had been a while since Rachel ventured into the attic, but today something urged her to go. It wasn't a conscious decision, not entirely. She felt drawn to the dark space above them, as if something, some unseen force, was calling her. The stairs creaked underfoot as she made her way up, each step causing the air to grow heavier, colder. She reached the top and pushed open the attic door, the faintest of groans greeting her ears as it swung wide. Inside, dust hung in the air like fog, thick and heavy. Old trunks, forgotten relics of a past life, littered the space, their contents concealed by time. Cobwebs stretched like broken strings across the rafters. But what caught Rachel's attention wasn't the dust or the trunks. It was the mirrors. She had not noticed them before, but now they stood at odd angles, leaning against the walls. They were old, their frames tarnished, and the glass was warped and cracked, distorting the reflections of the room. Yet something in the way the mirrors were arranged disturbed her. It was as though they had been placed deliberately, as if they were meant to show something, or someone. Rachel stepped closer to one, her pulse quickening. Her reflection stared back at her. Only it wasn't quite right. Her eyes were hollow, her skin too pale, her lips stretched in a smile that didn't belong to her. The room around her flickered in the mirror, distorting into an alternate version of itself, darker, colder, and more oppressive. The shadows deepened, creeping in from the corners, and then the mirror shifted. Her reflection twisted, her face contorting in pain. The eyes in the glass grew wide, black as midnight. It reached out from the frame, its fingers stretching toward her. Rachel stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was a shadow, a thing born of the glass, trying to reach out, trying to claim her. She turned and fled from the attic, her mind spinning with the images she had seen. The house was trying to break through, trying to pull her into its dark heart, and it was doing the same to Emma. Rachel was shaking now. Her hands trembled as she reached the bottom of the stairs, her eyes frantically searching for any sign of her daughter. She had to find Emma. They had to leave. But when she entered the living room, her breath caught. The room had changed. It wasn't just the furniture that had shifted. The walls themselves had begun to warp, twisting and expanding like the inside of a living thing. The air was thick with a rancid smell, something rotting, something ancient. The fireplace crackled unnaturally, its flames flickering with an unholy light, casting long, crawling shadows across the room. And there, in the center of it all, was Emma. She was standing perfectly still, her arms at her sides, her head tilted back as if she were listening to something just beyond the veil of reality. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her lips moved, whispering something Rachel could not hear, but felt in her very bones. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she moved closer, her voice shaking as she called out her daughter's name. Emma! Emma, please, come back to me! Emma's head snapped toward her, her eyes blank, vacant. The game is waiting, she whispered, her voice a distant echo. We can't escape. We are already a part of it. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as Emma's smile twisted into something unnatural. It was no longer her daughter standing there, but something else. Something that had worn Emma's face, that had claimed her body, her soul. And Rachel knew in that moment that the house had already won Chapter 5. The Reckoning, Part 2. The air in the living room had become thick, suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on Rachel. The whispers from the shadows, low, guttural sounds that seemed to slither through the room, grew louder. They were not just words, but tendrils of fear and malice, coiling around her. Rachel's breath came in shallow gasps, her heart hammering against her ribs, but she refused to turn away. Her eyes never left Emma. Her daughter stood motionless, her pale face expressionless. Her eyes now completely empty, black voids that reflected nothing. The girl Rachel had raised, the child she had loved with every ounce of her being, was gone. In her place stood something twisted, something cold. "Emma!" Rachel's voice was barely a whisper, breaking through the oppressive silence. "Please, fight it. Come back to me." But Emma didn't respond. Instead, she slowly lifted one hand and pointed toward the far corner of the room, where a dark figure had materialized out of the shadows. Rachel's blood ran cold. It was not a human figure, but something far darker, something that was neither fully alive nor fully dead. It was a thing of nightmares, its form shifting, flickering like smoke. But its eyes, those hollow black pits, were unmistakably familiar. The house. The house was watching her. Rachel's knees buckled under her as a crushing weight seemed to settle on her chest. She stumbled backward, her eyes never leaving the figure in the corner. But she could feel it now. The house was alive in a way she could not explain, its presence tangible, heavy, pressing against her like a suffocating fog. "Emma!" she gasped again, her voice hoarse now. "Where are you? Come back to me, please." But the girl didn't move. The house had already claimed her, and Rachel realized with chilling certainty that this was no longer just about Emma. This was about the house. And the house had always known. And the world around her began to shift, the air warping, bending unnaturally as though reality itself were being stretched like the glass of a broken mirror. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, twisting in unnatural patterns, crawling toward her, reaching out for her with long, clawed fingers. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls like specters. Her heart raced, panic surged through her veins. But Rachel forced herself to remain still, to think, to find some way out of this nightmare. She had to do something. The walls groaned, the house itself groaning in time with her growing dread, as if feeding off her fear. A faint hum vibrated through the floorboards, a low, vibrating hum that seemed to echo in her bones. The same hum she had felt last night, when she had stood in the hallway. "Emma!" Rachel shouted again, her voice shaking with desperation. She took a tentative step toward her daughter, her arms outstretched, but Emma didn't move. The thing that wore her face stood stock still, staring at her, its vacant eyes locked onto hers. Then the whispers began again, this time louder, clearer. "You can't leave," they hissed, their voices like the rustle of dry leaves. "You're already a part of it. You can't escape." Rachel stumbled backward, her breath coming faster now, chest heaving. She felt her mind unraveling, slipping toward the edge of sanity. The house was toying with her, pulling at her very soul. She had seen it before, flickers in the mirrors, in the shadows, but now it was real. The house had a mind of its own, a cruel, ancient will, and it was not about to let her go. A sudden violent crash echoed from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Rachel's head snapped up. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps grew louder, closer, echoing down the narrow hallway. But there was no one there, no one Rachel could see. Then she heard the whisper again, this time coming from Emma's mouth. Only it wasn't Emma's voice anymore. "The game, it's waiting. For you." Rachel's blood ran cold. She wanted to run, to scream, to fight against whatever had taken her daughter's body, but her legs wouldn't move. The darkness in the room had thickened, pressing against her chest until she felt like she couldn't breathe. And then, from the corner of the room, a door slowly creaked open. Rachel's instinct screamed at her to run, but her body refused. She had no choice but to step toward it, her feet dragging her unwillingly forward. Each step felt like wading through molasses, every inch an effort against the crushing force of the house. She stepped into the darkness. The room was cold, colder than any room should be. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of decay hung in the air, as if the room had not been opened in years, perhaps even decades. A single lamp flickered on the far wall, casting weak, trembling light that barely reached the corners. It was a room she had never seen before. The walls were lined with shelves, old, rotting books, and dusty jars filled with strange, unidentifiable objects. At the far end of the room, an old wooden chest sat in the corner, its surface cracked and stained. Rachel felt drawn to it, though every part of her screamed not to approach. She forced herself forward, her heart pounding as she reached for the chest. It was locked, but the moment her fingers brushed against the cold wood, the lock clicked open as if it had been waiting for her. A low, guttural laugh echoed around the room. The lid creaked open slowly, revealing the contents inside. It was dark, but Rachel could make out the shape of something. Something small and round, nestled in the corner of the chest. Her breath caught as she saw it. A tiny wooden top, just like the one Ethan had found under the floorboards. The same top. The laughter grew louder now, surrounding her, filling the room with a sickening, oppressive sound. The top spun on its own, its movement jerky, unnatural, like it was being pulled by some invisible force. It spun faster and faster, and the shadows around Rachel grew deeper, swirling like a storm, as if they were being drawn into the top. And then she heard it. A voice, cold, mocking, like the sound of death itself. "It's too late." Rachel's heart stopped. The top stopped spinning, its motion freezing mid-air, suspended in the heart of the room. And then everything went silent. She turned, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but the room was no longer the same. The walls had receded, the shelves had vanished, and the floor beneath her feet had become nothing more than a black void, stretching endlessly into nothingness. She was falling, spiraling downward into the abyss. The house was pulling her in, consuming her soul, her sanity. Emma's whisper echoed in her ears. "We're already a part of it." The darkness was all-encompassing now, swallowing her whole. And then, she was gone. Chapter 6. The Forgotten Ones. Rachel awoke in darkness. The familiar weight of the house, the oppressive sense of something watching her, the whispers that seemed to swirl like forgotten memories. They all returned, though not as she had remembered. She had thought she had been consumed, lost to whatever fate awaited those who dared to tread too close to the heart of the house. But now she was somewhere else, somewhere hollow. Her body felt heavy, as though gravity had shifted, pulling her down into an abyss that refused to let go. She reached out, but her fingers brushed against something slick, cold. Stone, perhaps, or flesh. It was impossible to tell. The air smelled damp, stale, with the pungency of rot. Every breath she took seemed to draw the darkness closer, each inhale a slow descent into something worse. Where am I? The question echoed in her mind, but the answer never came. The silence was so absolute that it pressed against her ears, leaving her feeling suffocated. And then, the sound, a soft, wet, dragging sound, reached her ears. A shuffling step, then another. It was slow, deliberate, coming closer, closer still. No, she wasn't alone. Rachel fought the overwhelming desire to scream, her throat closing with the panic clawing its way up her spine. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to get away, but the air was thick, and her legs refused to move. She was trapped in this place that felt as though it had no end, no exit. Then came a voice. It wasn't the voice of her daughter, nor any human voice she recognized. It was deeper, older, ancient even, a voice like the sound of something that had long been buried, risen from its grave. "You You should not have come." The words hung in the air, cold as ice, sending a shudder through Rachel's bones. Her heart raced in her chest, but her body remained frozen, unwilling to move, unwilling to face what was behind her. Every inch of her screamed to flee, but she knew, deep down, that running would not help. Not here. Not in this place. She turned slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dim, ghostly light that bathed the scene. She was standing in a long corridor. Stone walls, cold and uneven, stretching endlessly in both directions. No windows, no doors, only the suffocating silence, broken only by that dragging sound. And then the figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin, like a grotesque caricature of a human being. Its skin was pale, stretched taut over bones that seemed to creak with every movement, as though it were held together only by the will of something darker. The creature's face was obscured by a veil of shadow, its eyes, if they could be called eyes, nothing more than empty hollow sockets, black as the void. Rachel felt the weight of its gaze, even though she could not see it. It was a presence that seemed to seep into her very soul, clawing at her insides. The darkness around her seemed to pulse, as if the house itself was breathing, alive with hunger. The creature stopped before her, its hands twitching at its sides like claws, sharp and jagged, as if it had not used them in years. The silence stretched longer, as if the world was holding its breath. And then finally, it spoke. "You have disturbed the balance," it rasped, its voice a low whisper that seemed to echo from the deepest pits of the earth. "You and your child. You have woken us." Rachel's pulse quickened. The word sent a chill through her, deeper than the cold of the room, deeper than the house itself. Woken them. She hadn't asked for any of this. She had only wanted to find Emma, to understand what had happened to her, why the house, why it had done this. But the creature before her was ancient, and it knew more than she could ever understand. "You sought answers, but you do not comprehend the price." The creature's lips twisted, though it was not clear if it even had lips at all. It was as if its face was a mask, constantly shifting, refusing to reveal anything truly solid. The house has claimed its own. It has always claimed what it desires. Rachel's breath hitched. "Emma? Where is she? What have you done to her?" The creature's head tilted to the side, its empty eyes narrowing, as though considering the question. "Your daughter is not as you remember her. She is part of the house now, just as you are. She belongs to us." "No, no, she doesn't." Rachel's voice broke, a sob escaping her chest. "You can't take her. She's my daughter. She's not like you." The creature made a sound, something between a laugh and a growl. It was impossible to tell. "Do you think she is still your daughter? Do you think she still has the heart that you once held so dearly? The house has rewritten her, just as it will rewrite you. In time. It always does." Rachel's chest tightened, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I won't let you have her." The creature's thin lips curled into a smile that was not a smile at all, but something much darker, much more sinister. "You have no choice, Rachel. The house does not allow such things." And with that, the room around her seemed to shift. The walls began to close in, narrowing as if the very space she occupied was folding in on itself, shrinking, tightening. The floor beneath her feet buckled, the stone cracking, as though the house itself were about to swallow her whole. "Stay with us," the creature whispered, its voice now a chorus of thousands of voices, all speaking in unison, their tones hollow and mournful. "You are ours, just as she is. Together you will remain." Rachel screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, her voice lost to the endless void. The walls trembled as the house groaned in response, its hunger insatiable, its thirst for the living endless. And then, as if the house had had enough of her resistance, a new figure stepped from the shadows. At first, Rachel thought it was Emma, but as the girl drew closer, she saw the truth. It was a hollow version of her daughter, her face distorted and cracked, her eyes like blackened pits of nothingness. Emma's body was still moving, but the soul, The essence that had once been her was gone. "Emma!" Rachel cried, reaching for her. But the girl only tilted her head, her lips curling into a smile that was nothing like the girl Rachel had raised. "You can't save me, Mum," Emma said, her voice a distorted echo of its former self. "I belong to the house now, just like you will." Rachel fell to her knees, her body trembling as the weight of the truth crashed down on her. The house had already taken Emma. It had taken her long before Rachel had ever understood what was happening. And now it was coming for her. There is no escape. Chapter 6. The Forgotten Ones. Continued. Rachel's body trembled, not from the cold of the stone floor beneath her, but from a deep, unrelenting terror that threatened to unravel every inch of her soul. She stared at the figure of Emma, her once beloved child, now twisted, fractured, and hollow. The creature had told her the truth. Emma was lost, and so too was she. They were all part of the house now, their fate sealed by forces beyond comprehension, beyond her control. But even as the blackened voids that had once been Emma's eyes locked onto hers, a tiny, stubborn part of Rachel's mind still clung to one last shred of hope. There has to be a way out. There must be. Her breath came in ragged bursts, each exhalation trembling like the last gasp of a dying thing. She wanted to run. She wanted to escape. But every part of her being screamed that this house was not just a structure of walls and rooms. It was a living thing, breathing and watching, and it had no intention of letting her go. "You still don't understand, do you?" The voice of the creature, still a chorus of 1,000 voices, echoed through the chamber, vibrating in her bones. "The house is eternal. It feeds on your fear, your sorrow, your memories. It does not let go, not ever." Rachel tried to rise, her legs unsteady, but the ground beneath her seemed to soften, as though it were sucking her back into the depths. She collapsed forward onto her hands, the stones scraping her skin raw, and the chilling sensation of something crawling beneath the surface of the floor sent a violent shudder through her body. The house was alive, but in a way that was not human. It had no compassion, no remorse. It existed solely to consume. "Emma," she whispered, as if speaking her daughter's name, could somehow resurrect the girl she once knew, the real Emma. "Please, please, if there's any part of you still in there, come back to me. Don't let them take you." But the hollow figure that stood before her was not the Emma Rachel had held close, sung to sleep, watched grow. The thing before her was a shadow of what had once been, and in its eyes there was only emptiness, a vast void that swallowed all light and hope. "You've lost her," the thing spoke, its voice soft, too soft, like the wind that whispers through cracks in the earth. "You always were too weak to see what was happening. She was never yours to keep. We always find the ones who belong here." Rachel recoiled, as though struck by an invisible force. "No, you're wrong. She was mine. She was my daughter. You can't take that from me." The shadow smiled, but there was nothing human in that smile. It was a distortion, a grotesque thing that stretched too wide, revealing too many teeth, far too many. "You don't understand, Rachel. She was already chosen long before you came. The house has always had its eyes on the lost, the desperate. It feeds on their grief, their love, because that is what makes them weak." She wanted to shout, to scream, to tear the very walls apart in her fury. But no sound came. No words could fill the gaping silence that surrounded her. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all of it closed in on her. This house, this thing, it was a parasite, a malevolent force that devoured everything in its path, and Emma had been its first victim. Rachel's love had made her the perfect prey. A sound, soft, a creak in the distance. Rachel turned, frantic, looking for the source of the sound, but the house offered no answers, only the shifting, unsettling darkness. The dragging sound of something heavy, something close, began again. It was nearer now, coming for her. She stumbled to her feet, her heart hammering in her chest. "No, no, I can't stay here. I won't let you take me too." The creature stepped forward. Its movements were unnatural, like the slow unfolding of some monstrous nightmare. It reached out, its claws scraping against the stone walls, leaving jagged marks in their wake. The darkness seemed to bend around it, following its every movement, feeding off its presence. Rachel backed away, her breath shallow and desperate. "Please, just tell me what you want. Why my daughter?" The creature paused, a long moment of silence stretching between them. "The house doesn't want what you think it wants. We don't want the living. We want the lost." Its voice turned softer, almost coaxing. "Your daughter was lost the moment she stepped foot inside. All that is left is the empty shell that walks in her place." Rachel's mind reeled. The house had been calling to Emma. She had heard the whispers, seen the strange behavior in her daughter long before everything had spiraled into madness. She had been too blind, too busy with her own grief to understand. And now, Emma was gone, consumed by something far beyond her comprehension. "No." Rachel's voice was a broken whisper, a plea to the very darkness that surrounded her. "I won't accept this. I can't." The figure of Emma, the twisted shell that remained, stepped forward, her movements jerky, uncoordinated, as though the body was still learning to function after some great trauma. Her eyes were empty, yet fixed on Rachel with a gaze that carried an unbearable weight of sadness. The real Emma, the child who had laughed and smiled, was no longer there. What stood in her place was only a hollow imitation, one that could not love, could not remember. "Mom!" The thing spoke, its voice like a broken record, echoing the remnants of Emma's once sweet tone. "I'm not here anymore." Rachel felt her heart shatter, an awful tearing sensation that echoed through her chest. Her hands shook, and her knees buckled beneath her. "Emma, please, please come back." The creature stepped forward, its hands, claws now, reaching for her. "There is no coming back, not for her, not for you. You belong to us now." The walls seemed to close in further. The house began to hum, a low, unsettling sound that vibrated through her entire being. The stone beneath her feet softened again, threatening to pull her down, to drag her into the earth itself. It was hungry. The house was hungry, and it had claimed another soul. Rachel, feeling the weight of everything she had lost, her daughter, her hope, her sanity, closed her eyes. She had no strength left to fight. The darkness wrapped around her, suffocating, pulling her in. The creature's claws grazed her arm, cold and unfeeling. And in that instant, Rachel felt herself slipping, falling, her existence dissolving into nothing. This is not the end. The thought was a whisper, fleeting, barely audible in the depths of her mind. It didn't come from her. It wasn't her voice, but she heard it, felt it, and with it came the faintest glimmer of light. Chapter 7. The depths of forever. The air was thick, a palpable weight that clung to Rachel's skin like the rancid breath of something ancient, something untouchable. Even the shadows themselves seemed to have a texture, a substance that stretched and moved as if alive. It was as if the house had learned to breathe, to pulse, to feel. It was no longer just a prison. It was a living thing, and it had tasted her sorrow, her despair. Her body trembled, yet she stood still, anchored to the floor as the darkness pressed closer, surrounding her, swallowing her every thought. The creature's touch lingered on her arm, ice cold and unyielding. It was not a mere hand, but a manifestation of something far more monstrous, a spectre of anguish, a harbinger of the unending torment she had been cursed to endure. The walls around her groaned as if in sympathy, the very stones of the house shifting beneath the weight of the curse that had been laid upon her. And Emma, her daughter, her lost child. She could feel her presence, could sense the faintest echo of the girl she had once known, somewhere deep within the twisting corridors of this accursed house. The hollow, twisted thing before her bore her features, her likeness. But it was not Emma. It was a mockery, a vile imitation that wore her face and carried her name. The real Emma had been devoured, consumed by the house's insatiable hunger. The creature, her daughter's body now a hollow vessel, stepped away from her, and Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she watched. The thing moved with the same eerie, jerky grace it had before, But now it spoke in a voice that was not Emma's. It was lower, rougher, a guttural tone that scraped against the fragile thread of Rachel's sanity. "Do you want to save her, Rachel?" The voice came from Emma's lips, but it was wrong, too wrong. "Do you want to bring her back?" Rachel's heart lurched. Her fingers curled into fists, the nails biting into her palms. She had no more tears left to shed, no more strength to scream. She was tired, exhausted from the weight of the house, from the crushing knowledge that nothing she could do would ever undo what had been done. "I want my daughter back," Rachel whispered, though her voice faltered like the last breath of a dying thing. "Please, I want her back." The creature's eyes, empty, endless voids, met hers, and Rachel could see a flicker of something within them. Something old, something dark. It grinned, a grotesque stretching of the mouth that revealed far too many teeth, sharp and glistening with malice. "You cannot save her, Rachel. She is gone," the creature hissed, the sound slithering through the room like a serpent. "But you can join her. Join her in the house." The walls around her creaked in response, as if they were whispering in agreement, pulling closer, inch by inch. The house was alive, and it wanted her. Not just her body, but her soul. It hungered for it, just as it had hungered for Emma's, and for all those who had wandered too deep into its labyrinthine halls. Rachel's mind raced. She couldn't accept this. She couldn't, wouldn't. There had to be a way out. She had to find Emma. There had to be something left of her. She can't be gone. She can't. The house groaned again, its voice a deep, guttural sound that seemed to echo from the very foundations. The floor beneath her feet shifted, as if it was trying to pull her down into its depths. The walls expanded, and Rachel could feel the pressure building, the air becoming thick, suffocating. It was closing in on her. But through the suffocating darkness, a flicker of light appeared. It was small, distant, but undeniable, a faint, almost imperceptible glow. Rachel blinked, unsure if she had imagined it, but then the light pulsed again, brighter this time, like the beating of a heart. "Help me," Rachel whispered, not to the creature, but to the light. "Please, help me find her. Help me save my daughter." But there was no reply. Only the oppressive weight of the house continued to press in around her. "Behold." Rachel stumbled back, her mind spiraling. The voice, no, voices, echoed in her mind, weaving together like a sinister chorus, urging her to succumb, to give in, to accept the reality of her nightmare. But even in the face of overwhelming despair, something within her refused to yield. The creature moved closer again, its twisted form shifting in the darkness like a phantom, its presence suffocating, its power undeniable. But there was something else, a presence, something not of this world, something older than the house, older than the creature, older than anything Rachel could comprehend. And then the walls began to tremble. "Tamasai." It started as a low rumble beneath her feet, a vibration that seemed to grow, reverberating through the very bones of the house. The shadows shifted, the darkness pulsing like a living thing. For a moment, the house seemed to breathe, a slow, agonizing breath, as if it had awakened from a long slumber. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, the noise deafening, but she couldn't look away. The pulse grew stronger, each beat shaking the walls, the floor, the air itself. And then, through the cacophony, a sound emerged. A voice, not the creature's, but something else. Something distant. Something familiar. "Emma," Rachel gasped, the name escaping her lips like a prayer. She staggered forward, her mind splitting with the effort to understand what was happening. She heard it again, the faint whisper, just beyond her grasp, like a memory she could almost reach, but not quite touch. "Emma!" she called, her voice trembling. The house groaned louder, its walls bulging, the dark corners shifting and stretching like a living organism. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was not the creature, but a girl, a young girl, her features delicate, her eyes wide with fear. She was small, pale, and dressed in tattered clothes, her hair tangled and wild, as though she had been lost for a lifetime. And in her arms, she held something. Someone. Rachel's breath caught. It was Emma. The girl's body was limp, her face pale, but there was something about her, something that felt real, not like the creature that had claimed her name. This was Emma. This was her daughter, or at least what was left of her. "Emma!" Rachel cried, rushing forward. But the girl stepped back, her eyes wide and filled with a sadness that Rachel could not begin to understand. "Don't," the girl whispered. "It's too late. She's already gone." Rachel froze, her body shuddering. The girl in front of her was speaking, but Rachel's gaze was fixed on the form of Emma in her arms, the lifeless body of her daughter, still and pale. Rachel's world cracked apart, the terrible realization washing over her like a wave. Emma was gone. But still, the girl spoke, her voice shaking as though she, too, were caught in the web of the house's hunger. "You cannot save her, Rachel. She belongs to the house now." Rachel reached out, her fingers trembling, desperate to touch her daughter, but the girl pulled back, vanishing into the shadows before Rachel could lay a hand on her. The house was alive. The house was forever, and Emma would never come back. Chapter 8. Beneath the skin of eternity. Rachel's breath was shallow, caught in the vice of despair. The house had swallowed her whole. The walls had closed in, and the air itself was thick with the weight of its eternal hunger. She could feel it now, not just pressing against her skin, but inside her, underneath, where her flesh met the bone. The house had seeped into her very soul, twisting her thoughts, corrupting her desires. It had made her part of it, just as it had made Emma part of it. Her legs trembled, unable to support her, but somehow she remained standing. The room around her was alive. The floor beneath her feet groaned as if it was about to give way entirely. But instead, it shifted, the boards creaking and popping like the cracking of old bones. The walls seemed to sway, breathing in time with her own heartbeat, a rhythm that felt far too ancient, far too wrong. She could still hear Emma's voice, faint but clear, whispering from somewhere deep within the house. The girl who had once been her daughter, her sweet, innocent Emma, was lost. Lost forever in the maw of the house. And yet, a part of Rachel clung to the belief that she could bring her back, that there was still a sliver of Emma left inside this horrific labyrinth. She turned and stumbled, her hands brushing against the walls, the rough surface scraping against her skin. The house was cold now, the warmth it had once exuded replaced by a chilling, suffocating coldness. Every breath Rachel took felt like it came from an abyss. There was no air left in this place. The shadows crept up on her, lapping at her ankles, pulling at her, hungry to claim her fully. "Emma!" she whispered again, her voice trembling. "Please, I can't lose you." But the voice that answered her was not Emma's. It was deeper, older, a rumbling growl that reverberated through the house like a thunderclap. "You are already lost," the voice said, and the walls trembled in response. "You have been from the moment you stepped foot in this house." Rachel staggered, clutching at her chest. Her heart raced in her ears. The voice was familiar, yet alien. It was not the creature that had posed as Emma. It was something older, something more terrifying, something that had been in the house long before she had arrived. She could feel it now, crawling along the edges of her consciousness, scratching and gnawing at the thin layer of sanity she had left. "You cannot escape," the voice continued, its tone rich with malice. "The house knows you, Rachel. It knows your fears, your desires. It knows your pain. It feeds on it." Rachel clenched her fists, forcing herself to breathe. She could not break. She would not break. The thought of Emma, the girl who had once danced in the sunlight, who had smiled at her with all the joy of youth, kept her tethered, kept her fighting. But the shadows in the room deepened, pooling like ink, seeping into the very air, pressing down on her. The walls seemed to melt, their edges fraying like torn cloth. The house had grown stronger. It had tasted her despair, and it was hungry for more. "Why?" Rachel cried, her voice raw. "Why are you doing this? Why won't you let me save her? Because, the voice hissed, she was never yours to save. The shadows began to move now, not just the inanimate blackness that filled the corners, but something alive, undulating, writhing. It slithered along the floor, along the walls, its presence overwhelming. Rachel could feel its weight, its mass, as it pressed in on her from all sides. And then, with a sudden, sickening clarity, she understood. The house wasn't a prison. It was not merely a structure. It was a living, breathing entity, a thing with a will and a hunger that was as old as time itself. It didn't just take lives. It consumed souls. It twisted them, broke them, turned them into part of its eternal hunger. She is mine, the voice crooned. Emma was always mine. You were merely the vessel, the unwitting source of her blood, and now you will join her. Forever! The words tore through Rachel's mind, but even as they did, she found herself unable to move. The weight of the house pressed down harder, suffocating her. She could feel her body weakening, her strength draining, as if something was slowly sucking the life out of her. Please! Rachel gasped, her voice barely a whisper. Please, I will do anything to bring her back. The house responded in a way that made Rachel's blood run cold. The walls shuddered and groaned, their surfaces warping like flesh in the grip of some ancient, terrible fever. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Emma, or at least, it looked like her. Her hair was tangled, her face pale and drawn, her body broken and lifeless. But the eyes, those eyes were empty, hollow, vacant. Rachel reached for her, but the girl stepped back, her form blurring, flickering like a dying candle. And then, with a final terrible shriek, Emma's body dissolved into the shadows, leaving nothing behind but the echo of her voice. Join me, Rachel, forever. The voice wasn't Emma's anymore. It had changed. It had become something darker, something far more powerful. Rachel fell to her knees, her hands shaking as she covered her face. She could feel it now, the darkness pulling at her, threatening to drag her into the depths of the house. It was inevitable. She had known it all along. The house had claimed her. She was no longer a visitor. She was part of it now, a piece of its twisted, eternal hunger. But as the darkness closed in, she heard something else, a faint, distant whisper that cut through the oppressive silence. It was weak, faint, but unmistakable. Rachel! Her heart stuttered in her chest. The voice was familiar. It was Emma's voice. Mom, Emma whispered. I'm still here. Rachel's head snapped up. Was it a trick? Was the house playing with her? Her fingers dug into the floor, the cold wood biting into her skin as she forced herself to rise. The voice was distant, but it was there, coming from the depths of the house. It was Emma, her daughter, the real Emma. Mum, please. Rachel's body shook as she stumbled toward the voice. She had to reach her. She had to save her. She couldn't lose her again. The house groaned in protest, the walls shifting and warping as if to block her path. The shadows swirled around her, whispering in low, guttural tones. But Rachel fought them back, pushing forward with every ounce of strength she had left. The darkness pressed against her, trying to drag her down, but she ignored it. All that mattered now was Emma. Her daughter was alive, somewhere in this place, and Rachel would do anything to find her. The voice grew louder now, clearer. She could almost hear Emma's footsteps. She could almost reach her. Mom! And then, in the deepest recesses of the house, something stirred. A presence, ancient and terrible. Something that had been waiting for this moment for longer than Rachel could comprehend. She is mine, the voice said again, now loud and thunderous. She has always been mine. But Rachel was not listening anymore. The darkness had already claimed so much of her. But it would not take her hope. She could feel the pull of Emma's voice, faint but insistent, leading her forward. Don't let go, the voice whispered. Come back to me, Rachel. Chapter 9. The Depths of the Void. Rachel's breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling as she fought against the suffocating darkness that pressed in from all sides. It was no longer just the house that hunted her. It was the very void itself, a formless abyss that seemed to stretch endlessly, consuming everything it touched. The walls had dissolved entirely, leaving her standing in a chasm of blackness that seemed to fold in on itself, shifting and moving like liquid. Her feet no longer touched solid ground. The floor beneath her felt like it was made of air, like stepping on the surface of a dream that might shatter with the slightest misstep. But she kept moving, driven by the singular thought that Emma was somewhere ahead, somewhere close. The distant echo of her daughter's voice still rang in her ears, a faint, desperate cry that beckoned her forward through the abyss. She couldn't look back. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn around, to escape before the darkness swallowed her whole. But Rachel knew. She knew deep within her bones that if she didn't keep going, if she didn't reach Emma, she would be lost forever. The house, or whatever it had become, would claim her completely. There would be no returning from this place. And yet, as her mind battled between hope and terror, there was something more, something darker. The shadows whispered, curling around her thoughts like tendrils of poison, urging her forward, and with each step, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, more familiar. "Rachel! Rachel!" The voice echoed, thick with a sorrow that felt like a wound that would never heal. She paused, her heart lurching in her chest. The voice, it was Emma's voice, but it sounded wrong. There was an undertone to it now, something she couldn't place, a distortion, a corruption that made her skin crawl. "No," Rachel whispered to herself, her hand instinctively reaching out into the blackness. "No, Emma, please. Where are you?" Her fingers brushed against something cold, slick, like stone or bone, or something in between. She recoiled, the sensation of being watched washing over her. The void seemed to shrink and tighten, pressing in on her from all directions, the walls of this infernal place no longer distant but close, too close. The air grew colder with each passing second, and Rachel felt a chill gnaw at her bones. Her breath misted in front of her face, but it wasn't the cold that made her shudder. It was the growing sense of something behind her, something moving just out of reach, circling her, watching her. "Rachel, you should have stayed." The voice came again, low and hollow. It reverberated from every corner of the darkness, distorting until it sounded like a chorus of many voices, layered on top of one another. The air hummed with an unnatural frequency now. It pressed against her eardrums like a thick, wet cloth. The pressure was suffocating, drowning out everything but that awful, wrong voice. She spun around, desperate, her heart hammering in her chest, but there was nothing but darkness. And then it moved. A shadow, taller than anything she could comprehend, slid from the edges of the abyss, coalescing into form. It was too much to bear, too monstrous to describe. Rachel could only see flashes of it, sharp angles, undulating shapes, something that defied all logic. It was as if the very fabric of reality bent around it. It had no face, no eyes, just presence. "Emma?" Rachel's voice broke, trembling like a leaf in the wind. The shadow stretched forward, engulfing her vision in a sudden rush. She stumbled backward, but her feet didn't move as they should. She was stuck in place, like a fly in amber, unable to escape. A figure emerged from the dark, a silhouette, and Rachel's heart skipped a beat. Her breath hitched as the form took shape. It was Emma, but not. Her daughter stood before her, but her eyes were empty, hollowed out, like the eyes of a doll with no soul. Her skin was grey, with a sickly pallor, and her hair hung in wet clumps around her face. She reached toward Rachel, her fingers elongated and twisted, like the branches of a tree that had never seen sunlight. "Mom!" Emma's voice was a whisper now, barely audible, choked with something vile. "Mom, help me." Rachel's chest tightened with the weight of her grief, but something was wrong. She could feel it in her gut, the sense that this was not Emma, not anymore. This was something else, something the house had shaped from the fragments of her memory and hope. "You're not her," Rachel gasped, stepping back. The figure of Emma faltered for a moment, then smiled, a grin so wide it stretched unnaturally across her face. revealing sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the faintest light. "Who else would I be, Rachel?" the voice whispered, now low and mocking. "You wanted her back, didn't you? This is what you wanted." Rachel's mind reeled. This thing, this creature was mocking her. Her grief, her pain, her love for her daughter. It was a grotesque parody, a reflection of everything she had hoped for, now twisted into something monstrous. "No!" Rachel cried, shaking her head as her hands balled into fists. "I didn't want this. I wanted my daughter back." The smile on Emma's face grew wider, stretching impossibly. "This is what the house offers," it hissed, the voice growing deeper, merging with the shadows around it. "Take it or leave it. It doesn't matter. You will be part of it either way." Rachel staggered backward, her legs giving way beneath her. She fell to her knees, her hands trembling as they clutched at the cold, featureless floor. "Please, Emma. I don't want this. Please!" Her voice cracked, desperation flooding her every word. The figure of Emma's twisted form flickered and blurred, changing like smoke in the wind. The shadows around her writhed as if they were alive, circling, crawling toward Rachel with predatory intent. Then, the voice, now a cacophony of overlapping whispers, filled the space. "She is lost. You are lost." And in that moment, the house seemed to open its gaping maw once again. Rachel's eyes went wide, and for a brief second, she felt the presence of something far older, far darker than she could have ever imagined. The house was no longer a structure. It was a living, breathing entity, a being that fed on souls. It had consumed Emma, and now it wanted her. But as the darkness closed in around her, a new sound emerged from the depths. Footsteps. A slow, rhythmic thud that echoed through the void. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The footsteps were real. They were approaching. And with them came the promise of something far worse than she could ever imagine. Chapter 10. The Unseen. Rachel's heart thundered in her chest, each beat reverberating in the emptiness around her. Her breath was ragged, her throat raw from crying out in vain. But there was no time to mourn. There was no time to question what was real anymore. Only one thought consumed her mind. Escape. She had to escape. For Emma. For herself. The footsteps grew louder, closer, each one resounding like a death knell in the abyss. They were heavy, deliberate, carrying an aura of inevitable doom. They didn't belong to Emma. No, the distorted, wretched form of her daughter was a thing of nightmares, a product of this place that defied reality. This was something else, something older, something far more dangerous. Rachel strained her ears, trying to focus through the cacophony of whispers, the slithering, suffocating presence of the darkness that seemed to press in on her from all sides. It was as if the very air was alive, hungry, waiting for her to make a mistake. Step. Step. The sound was so near now, so undeniably real. Rachel spun around, her pulse in her throat. She scanned the void, but it was impossible to see anything, not in the blackness that swallowed everything whole. And then, suddenly, a figure appeared, its form flickering in and out of focus like a mirage. It was tall, imposing, with an unnatural stillness to it. Its face was hidden in shadow, its body clothed in tattered robes that moved with an otherworldly grace. The air grew colder, and Rachel could feel a gnawing sensation at the base of her spine, as if whatever was standing before her was not quite human. But it was not the figure itself that terrified her. It was the presence of what it brought with it. The darkness around it seemed to move and twist, as if alive, as if it had a mind of its own. The figure stepped forward, its eyes, no, the absence of eyes, shifting toward Rachel. And in that moment, she felt a crushing weight descend upon her chest. It was as though the very soul of the house had manifested before her, a manifestation of everything that had died within its walls, of every tortured memory and forgotten scream. "You are lost," the figure intoned, its voice cold and hollow, like the wind through the branches of a dead tree. "There is no escape. Not from this place. Not from us." Rachel's breath hitched as the shadows seemed to curl toward her, tendrils reaching out, brushing against her skin. She tried to step back, but her legs betrayed her. rooted to the ground as though the very air had become thick, like molasses, holding her captive. "No!" Rachel gasped, her eyes darting desperately. "No, I can't. I can't stay here. I need to find Emma." The figure's lips, or something resembling them, twitched into something akin to a grin, though it was more a mockery than a smile. The darkness around it surged, coiling tighter, as though to suffocate her in its embrace. "Emma?" The figure's voice echoed in the dark, distorted and cruel. "Do you still believe she is here? Alive?" Rachel's stomach lurched. She clamped her hands over her ears, as though the words alone might tear her apart. "You're lying," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread, barely hanging on to sanity. "You're lying. I will find her. She's still here. I know it." The figure's laughter came then, cold and malicious, ringing out like a bell tolling in the distance, heralding something unspeakable. The shadows writhed in a twisted dance, as if in response to the laughter, pulling her closer toward the figure. "You want to believe that, don't you?" it murmured. "You want to hold on to the illusion of your daughter. But the truth, Rachel, is far worse than you can imagine. She is gone into the very heart of this place. And you—" It leaned closer, and Rachel could feel its breath, if it could be called that, cold against her skin, a whisper of death itself. "You will join her soon enough." The air grew colder still, and the darkness began to press in tighter, heavier. Every inch of space around Rachel seemed to be constricting, suffocating her. Her lungs felt as though they were filling with ice, her vision narrowing to nothing but the figure before her, its presence engulfing everything. But she couldn't let it win. She wouldn't. With every ounce of strength, she fought against the crushing force of the shadows. She took a step back, then another, her movements jerky and disjointed. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body refused to obey. The figure reached out then, its hand, if it could be called that, sliding toward her, a mass of shadow and bone. She could hear its hollow whispers in her mind, taunting her, telling her it was already too late. She couldn't let it win. Her eyes flitted toward the edges of the darkness, her mind grasping at the very last threads of her will. And then, from the corner of her vision, something moved. A figure, a small figure, standing just beyond the reach of the encroaching shadows. Rachel's breath caught. Emma. But it wasn't Emma. It couldn't be. The figure was translucent, barely more than a flicker in the darkness, a reflection of a memory rather than a living person. It reached out to her, a small hand stretched toward Rachel's own. Its face was blurred, indistinct, but the voice that came from it was unmistakable. "Mom!" Rachel gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. The darkness recoiled, just for a moment, as if repelled by the purity of that voice. It was as if the very act of remembering, of wanting, had the power to push back the shadows, if only for an instant. The figure stepped forward, and as it did, the void shuddered. The shadows hissed, recoiling, as if threatened by the light of something lost. And in that instant, Rachel saw it. A doorway. A flickering portal, barely visible in the swirling dark, but real nonetheless. She could feel it calling to her, a thin thread of hope cutting through the suffocating despair. The doorway was the key, the only way out. But the figure was still there. The presence of the house, no, of them, loomed like a weight upon her shoulders, heavier than anything she had ever known. "No, no, don't leave me!" The voice, Emma's voice, begged from within the shadows. But Rachel couldn't stay. She wouldn't. She turned her back on the figure, her feet finding strength she didn't know she had. Her breath was ragged, desperate, but she didn't stop. The doorway was there, just ahead. The whispers of the darkness grew more frantic, more shrill, as if trying to pull her back, to tear her apart. "Mum, please, don't leave me here!" Emma's voice screamed, breaking, torn by 1,000 unseen forces. Rachel ran, and just as she reached the threshold of the portal, she heard it, a voice, deep and guttural, echoing from the abyss. "You will never escape." Chapter 10. The Unseen, Part 2. Rachel's legs were burning as she ran, each desperate step carrying her further into the realm of shadow and silence. The portal was growing larger, its faint light a promise in the depths of the suffocating blackness that threatened to swallow her whole. Her breath came in jagged gasps, each inhale sharp and painful, as if the air itself was trying to choke her out. Her mind was a whirlwind, a cacophony of fragmented thoughts. Emma. She had heard her. That voice, torn, desperate, calling her name. It had to be real. It had to be. There was no other explanation. She was close. So close. The light. The portal. She could feel it pulling at her, urging her toward freedom. But the deeper she moved into the shifting shadows, the more that sense of pull became a weight, a suffocating force clinging to her very soul. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, as though it were shifting in response to her every movement, as if the house itself were alive, a sentient thing trying to drag her back into its depths. And then behind her, a sound, faint at first, but growing louder, a scraping, a slow, deliberate dragging noise, as though something, or someone, was moving toward her. Rachel's heart lurched, her blood turning cold. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. Her feet moved faster, each step more desperate than the last, but it was as though the air itself was conspiring against her. The space around her felt smaller, tighter, and with every passing moment, the light of the portal seemed to flicker more erratically, as if struggling to stay alive. A sound like nails against wood echoed from behind her, a screeching, agonizing sound that made her want to claw her ears off just to escape it. No, not now. The thought screamed in her mind. The shadows thickened, rippling like liquid, as though trying to reach out, to grab her, to hold her in place. And then, she felt it. A cold hand wrapping around her ankle, yanking her back with a force that sent her crashing to the ground. Her breath left her body in a strangled gasp. The cold seeped through her, icy fingers digging into her flesh, pulling her deeper into the darkness. She clawed at the ground, trying to push herself forward, her hands scraping against the cold stone, but it was futile. The more she struggled, the tighter the grip became. Her heart was hammering now, every pulse a steady reminder of her failure to escape. The whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening, all of them speaking in a cacophony of forgotten voices. She tried to block them out, tried to silence them, but their words slithered into her ears, burrowing into her mind. It's too late, Rachel. You cannot run. You are ours now, forever. The air seemed to constrict, as though the walls were closing in on her. Her chest tightened. The darkness pressed against her from all sides, the shadows reaching for her with grasping, cold hands. They were trying to pull her under, trying to drag her down into the depths of the void where nothing escaped. But then, a sudden violent pulse of light. The portal. She could see it again, clear as day, its edges crackling with energy. The shadows recoiled from it, hissing, retreating like vampires from sunlight. The light was her only chance. Rachel reached for it. Her fingers grazed the edge of the portal, and a rush of warmth flooded her body. It was as if she had plunged her hand into the depths of the sun itself, the heat of it burning through her skin, flooding her with a sense of hope that she thought had died within her. She yanked herself forward, using the last of her strength to pull herself into the blinding light. But the hand on her ankle remained. It tightened its grip, pulling harder. Rachel screamed, but the sound was drowned by the growing roar of the portal's energy. She was being torn in two. For a moment, everything blurred. The world around her spun, twisted, and collapsed in on itself. She saw faces, hundreds of faces, emerging from the shadows. They were twisted, contorted, their eyes hollow and unblinking, their mouths open in silent screams. Their bodies shifted, elongated, bending unnaturally, as though they were more shadow than flesh. And through the chaos, one face stood out. One figure emerged from the swarm. It was Emma. Her daughter's form appeared just beyond the portal, a broken reflection of the girl Rachel had once known. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken deep into their sockets, but her mouth was a twisted, horrific grin, stretching far beyond the bounds of a human face. A scream, a guttural cry, ripped through Rachel's chest as she reached out for her daughter. But the figure only laughed. Laughed. A sound that made Rachel's blood run cold. "You can't save me, Mom." The voice was hollow, a mockery of Emma's. "You can't escape. Not from here. Not from us." The darkness surged forward, a tidal wave of shadows that crashed over her, drowning out the light. Rachel fought, her arms flailing, but the grip on her ankle was unyielding. The world twisted, shifting in impossible ways, and for a brief moment, she felt herself slipping into the void, lost forever to the endless night. And then, suddenly, the pressure vanished. The light, brighter than anything she had ever seen, ripped through her, pulling her upward, tearing the darkness away in an instant. Her body jerked forward, the shadows around her howling in fury. But she was no longer trapped. She was free. Her lungs filled with air, fresh and clean. The pain in her chest eased. The light enveloped her, warm and comforting, as though she had been born anew. She blinked, disoriented, and slowly, painfully, she rose to her feet. The portal was gone. She was standing in a familiar place, a hallway lined with old, dust-covered furniture. The house was still here, but it felt different. The air was heavy, thick with an unsettling calm. The suffocating presence of the darkness was gone, but so too was the light that had once been so welcoming. And then she heard it again. A soft rustling, a whisper in the silence. Rachel froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart skipped a beat. "Mum!" The voice was soft, a whisper, just a breath above the wind. But she knew it. She knew who it was. It was Emma. But this time the voice didn't sound broken or twisted. It was real, alive. The sound was full of pain, full of longing, but it was unmistakably her daughter. Rachel turned, her eyes scanning the dark, empty hallway. But there was no one there. "Emma?" she whispered, her voice trembling. And then, nothing. The silence returned, suffocating, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on her chest. Rachel's mind reeled, a million questions flooding her at once. What had just happened? Where was Emma? Was she still in the house, trapped by the same forces that had tried to take Rachel? Or was this a different kind of illusion? Was she hallucinating? A voice, deeper now, more resonant, filled the silence. It was the voice of the house, the voice of the darkness. "You cannot leave, not now, not ever."